the video up there.
So I did start recording just now.
Okay.
The HDMI not connected.
Let me exit from my presentation.
Here it is. Yeah, no, it was just,
Okay.
there, it's fine. Just make sure that this doesn't come out. This could wiggle.
Yeah. Why is it not letting me go
Move.
backwards?
Let's see. Should be able to move it with
There we
this.
go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. All right.
Is there a little
We should
thing
be
where
able
I
to
can
get-
see myself to make sure I stay where the camera is?
So I would recommend that against that, just because we should probably get rid of everything we can.
Well, if I could at least see where I'm supposed to be to start with.
Okay, yeah, we
And
can
how
do that.
far I can move.
Okay, we can definitely do that. So if you want to see where you are, you
Mhm.
can just go to video up here.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
but then that's going to show on the screen. And so
Right. But if I can have a sense of where I'm supposed to stand for 2 minutes. So, video. Okay.
So right now you're pretty well centered. The audio sounds good, and we can see your screen. So
Okay.
you look good to go. We'll give people a few minutes to get logged on. Sometimes when you
Okay.
use this program for the first time, it can take a few minutes to figure out.
Sounds good.
And now are you in a classroom? You have some people in there watching you live as well?
I do. I have.
Awesome.
I have
Hi, everyone.
a typical and friendly gathering.
Great.
Of folks from several different departments, actually. So we're doing our end to be interdisciplinary.
Sounds great.
Oh, it's using this camera. It's not using that thing at all.
that's why we're.
Okay, can I stick my laptop in there?
What happened is that we.
This is not part of our list.
Yeah, we can because we got it connected again, but we don't.
It's just. I was gonna put my laptop on it. Okay, I'm back here. Here I am?
There.
Okay.
I mean, that's the thing. Like these things are like super documented.
Yeah, they've semesters and semesters of pulling them in and out of classrooms, trying to get the heck out of Dodge. I'm not standing right in front of the screen for you guys. And that is controlling this, but not mine. Okay.
So Liz, you okay with about 2 minutes?
Yep.
Good.
And he's still listening to me through this?
He's listening to you through that.
Through that. Can you still hear me all right, John?
Yes.
Okay.
How about the rest of the group?
They can hear me fine. It's a small room.
No, I didn't mean that group. I meant the other group. We've seen that quite a few people here.
I'm not getting any messages that people can't hear, so I'm assuming
Okay.
we're good.
I don't have a little window open if you need to flag me down, but I figure you probably know how to make something pop up.
I can just jump in verbally too if someone messages
Right.
something that needs attention. All right, well, I can go ahead and kick you off with your introduction as people are still rolling in, and then we can get you started in just a few minutes here. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, thank you to everyone for joining us today for our United States Society for Ecological Economics webinar. This is a bi-monthly webinar series, and we're really excited to welcome Dr. Lizzie King here today. She has kindly agreed to present for us about some of her work. Dr. King is an assistant professor at the University of Georgia. She has a joint appointment in the Odum School of Ecology and the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. She has a bachelor's degree in biology from Reed College in Oregon, and a master's degree and PhD in population biology from UC Davis. So her research is focused on two main areas of sustainability science. The first focuses on the challenges faced by livestock herding societies in rural Africa, where people are struggling to secure sustainable livelihoods in the face of drastic environmental and social pressures. And to investigate this issue, she works with interdisciplinary teams, combining ecology and the social sciences to gain a more holistic view of livelihood vulnerability. And her second area of research is on restoration ecology in Georgia, where she studies how and why we repair damaged and degraded ecosystems. And this includes some work in Georgia's barrier islands and urban forests in Athens. So some technical notes, we just ask that you remain on mute for the first portion of the talk. If you have a technical question or something that really needs clarification, you can use the chat box. The little chat icon is the speech bubble in the bottom middle of your screen. You can either message everyone or you can send a message just to me and I can relay it. And then for the last 15 or 20 minutes or so, we'll open it up to everyone. You can come off mute to either ask questions or continue to type questions in the box. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. King.
Okay, thanks everyone out there in Cyberland, and thanks to my colleagues and folks who've come to watch here at UGA. So my screen isn't advancing. There we go. So I also want to say a big thanks to Ecological Economics, not just the society, but also the field. I'm new to this field. I'm not an economist. And it's been really exciting to realize that this is a discipline. And since we have folks from Ecological Society of America and also Environmental and Resource Economics joining us today, I thought I'd start with a little introduction to what ecological economics is. And it's a systems perspective on economics, which is very refreshing. That's how I look at ecosystems too, and also social systems, which views the economic system as existing within environmental systems, adjacent to or outside of them. And it has roots also linking it to systems ecology, with the likes of buzzsawing and sorry, I'm going to try and get rid of this little screen. Yeah, okay. And H.T. Odum, who all contributed ideas and collaborated with economists to think about the thermodynamics of energy on the planet in economic perspective as well as ecological. And the perspective also recognizes the interdependence of nature and society, and the idea of full substitutability of capitals doesn't really make sense from that point of view. So it is a field that expounds hard as opposed to soft sustainability, if you're familiar with those terms. And it's also a normative perspective that human well-being, sustainability, and equity and justice are both components of the goal and the vision of ecological economics. And I also prefer the precautionary principle in decision-making, where you're selecting the maximum of the best of the worst rather than the best of the best as your goals in decision-making. And I also think it's a really exciting perspective because it does focus so roundly on all the domains of sustainability. It's where a lot of exciting ecosystem services research is going on. And it's also, I think, a great approach to deal with wicked problems, ones that are intractable and have both policy and social dimensions. And it is interdisciplinary and inclusive, as evidenced by me being here as a non-economist. And it's also the underdog. This is a graph from a study of undergraduate economics education in the Netherlands. And if we are anything like them, one of those very slender slivers at the top that says 1% is the proportion of coursework that is given to ecological economics, as compared to the 86% that is straight up neoclassical. This is a really interesting study and puts several fields of economics into perspective for me in terms of where the dominant voices are coming from and whether that's a good or a bad thing. I always root for the underdog, so here we go. So this is one of my favorite quotes when we try to pick out anything in, once again, trying to get rid of this little window that keeps popping up. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And this really motivated me as an ecologist because it sort of captures my, searching for connections between one thing and the next to try and understand what's going on. And it also explains sort of how I've been navigating understanding ecological and human systems. And this talk is not going to be so much about my research, but the things I found as I've gone exploring, following connections, not only connections that are the key linkages between certain components of ecosystems and social systems, but also the connections between different analytical approaches. So this talk is going to be covering different analytical approaches that I think are interesting and worth bringing together and chatting about. So as an intro, I will start by talking about some of my connections and collaborations as a way to introduce the other folks who I work with who've contributed to these ideas. And then I'll start talking about ecosystem services and some of the evolving frameworks that we have and some of the limitations and complementary questions and lenses that are coming from other disciplines to make them fuller and richer and answer questions that I'm particularly interested in. And then some of the emerging methods to integrate those approaches. And then I'll look like, okay, this is really cool. Why aren't we doing more of this? And some thoughts on that. Okay, so like I said, I just have been out there observing a lot of things and seeing what appeals to me in terms of which way to try and study it. And I work in dry lands in Africa, and seeing land degradation, the fields and theories that I was finding to explain them were in restoration ecology and rangeland ecology. But having spent over 20 years out there working and living with folks, all the dynamics, the way people husband and steward the land, the way the land determines their livelihoods, and just the whole culture itself, I began to see are integrally connected to the ecological problems and brought me to the social ecological systems perspective and the scholarship in that field. That links a lot to resilience studies, which brought me to sustainability science via the great fortune of joining NC's working group that was doing the fundamentals of ecosystem services and sustainability science. We ended up diving. Is there someone who can mute their speaker? All right. Whatever that grinding was has stopped. Anyway, this working group was focused on ecosystem services, and that was my real foot getting in the door here and starting to think seriously about this. And it was my first time working with a real economist, and I've never been the same since. And then I came to the University of Georgia, where I am now, and started collaborating with an anthropologist and another anthropologist as a postdoc, and co-mentored a PhD student through the Center for Integrative Conservation Research, which we have here. This is my plug. It has a PhD program that trains students to think across disciplinary boundaries and entertain more than one perspective simultaneously. And when I sort of realized, okay, social ecological systems, I'm still doing it all with boxes and arrows, and there are some very, very different ways to study these systems. Mine duly blown. I got really, really excited and collaborated even more with lots of anthropologists. There's a hydrogeophysicist on there, a physicist who now does economics, and another natural scientist we've been working together to come up with some of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting you today. So those are all the folks whose ideas have contributed to this talk. And I'm really going to be focused on natural resource-based livelihoods, small-scale natural resource-based livelihood systems. Most of them are in the developing parts of the world. And these are systems that are undergoing a lot of change with the rest of the world. But it tends to affect these areas most directly because their livelihoods are so intimately linked to the natural resources in their landscape. And when economics change, when policies change, when the pressures on their land change, their livelihoods are very, very directly affected. And there aren't that many other opportunities out there. So these are folks who are trying to transition, to adapt to the changing conditions, both ecological, social, political, and economic, simultaneously, while still feeding themselves directly from the natural resources in their environment. This is a big challenge. It's a challenge for understanding the linkages between natural resources and human well-being, but in this extremely dynamic context. So this, I think, is the real challenge of sustainable development, is to think about the actual lived realities of these systems that are in rapid transition. And that's where I found a lot of traction with ecosystem services, but it is a complex affair. Although not everyone thinks it is. Bill Gates says, if you show people the problems and you show people the solutions, they will be moved to act. All right, I'm glad I got a few laughs. You can problematize every word in this, right? Which problems, who decides them, which solutions, and if they are moved to act, why, and if they act, what on earth do they do? These are actually big problems, and this is one of the challenges with sustainability, is to get beyond the simplistic view that an idea creates an outcome, because we all know good ideas don't always work. And one of the reasons that they don't always work is because these are complex adaptive systems. They are adapting, they are changing, and when something you think is going to work doesn't, it's usually because of the dynamism and the diversity in the system that you didn't account for. So moving from ecosystem services in its standard form to try and capture more of that, I think is a better way to both prevent bad mistakes and also realize where the innovations are that we can capitalize on. So the ecosystem services frame gives us a good starting point to link natural resources and human well-being. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and I like boxes and arrows. I confess I can't help it. They appeal to me, but what also appeals is that this does represent a lot of the interconnections that we care about when we're thinking about these resource-based societies in transition. So one thing I thought was curious is the only arrow that doesn't show that it's a target of strategies or interventions is the way people get their livelihoods from ecosystem services. That seemed kind of odd. It struck other people too, and that was quickly remedied. There's been a lot of attention paid to that particular arrow in the meantime.
Oh, maybe. I'm sorry.
Those are little indicators for strategies and
What time
interventions.
did you need to wake up? Oh,
Someone have a question for me?
7:30 that I even came in there.
No, someone isn't on mute. Not on mute. Please make sure to check your microphone.
Push me. You tell them, Aaron. Okay. So the economics of TEEB and biodiversity of ecosystems and biodiversity filled out that transition from the ecosystem itself by making more explicit actually it wasn't them, but they've been using this framework of Haynes and Potchkin and others for some time to indicate that there are more steps involved in the translation of a stock of a natural capital to some benefit or value that people get. And this has been a major improvement, mainly for accounting purposes. If you're trying to evaluate something, understanding the different steps through which that valuation needs to be calculated to get there is useful. But when I think about the folks that I work with in Kenya or societies elsewhere, I don't see this happening in their lives, and I still have questions about how are benefit streams actually realized, because maize doesn't go out and plant itself into a field and harvest itself and dry itself and turn into nutrition. There are things missing from this diagram. While it is true that regulating services can just form on their own, and a function delivers a service and that delivers a benefit, all of those provisioning and cultural services that people depend on don't happen by themselves. They need people somehow involved in the picture. And ecosystem services like those, including a lot of regulating services, are actually co-produced by people. And this gets left out. I mean, there are input costs calculated, but there's a little bit more to it when you get on the ground and try and understand what enables people to make these livelihoods. And I think that this is kind of an Africa-sized gap in a lot of approaches to sustainable development, is calculating how much, maize yield could come from this soil given its soil characteristics. There's a lot of other things in between there that we need to understand, particularly that the assets and capacities that people have to co-produce those services and benefits are variable between people. And if they're variable between people, then we need to somehow disaggregate these calculations that we're doing. And I think one of the tricks and one of the reasons that this emerged is that because this framework was really developed to make the case for valuing regulating services that were otherwise unaccounted for. And for things like carbon sequestration, which can be thought of as a public good, our atmosphere is shared by all of us, it works all right. But it runs into some problems when all these other types of ecosystem services are rivalrous or subtractable, where if one person is using it, someone else can use it less. And that is what is the basis of a lot of the inequalities that we see both in economies writ large, but particularly with development interventions. And this has not gone unnoticed. There have been a bunch of really beautiful papers that have worked on trying to articulate how these ecosystem services get co-produced and what we should be paying attention to and measuring and studying when we're out there in the field. For example, this is a diagram from the Fedele et al. Paper, Mechanisms Mediating the Contribution of Services to Human Well-Being. And there are a lot of them that mediate it, and they all have to do with the human side of the equation. You do have a few functions that occur without people needing to manage, mobilize, and appropriate it. And this little group of people up here at the top, or I guess I can point to it on the screen here, maybe, there it is. These are the attributes of the people that determine how that translation from a stock of natural capital gets made. And the one that I would draw your attention to is assets. These are the capacities that people have. And that's what, again, the next sort of phase of research has been starting to explore. And they're borrowing heavily from another framework that's ready-made already out there, but really hadn't been connected with ecosystem services until 3 or 4 years ago. And that's the Sustainable Livelihoods framework. And this has been contributed to by a number of people. Names like Chambers, Conway, Ian Scoons are up there. It was developed at the Institute for Development Studies in England and adopted by their Department of International Development as a way to counter the sort of broad, more aggressive development attitudes that were, pushing a lot of, sort of restructuring of developing countries' governments without paying attention to how that was affecting local people. So this approach is really focused on the rural poor and their lived realities and understanding their local perspectives. What are their constraints and capabilities for making their living? And the way they approach that is by considering what assets do they have and how do those assets constrain or enable them. And often these categories of capital get used to categorize and measure and assess and find indicators for those assets, because having those assets are what allow people the capability of making a livelihood, will allow them to turn natural capital and ecosystem service potential into something that contributes to their well-being. Questions of household level access to those assets, who controls that and how it's mediated by institutions, is another big branch of sustainable livelihoods frameworks, which has been largely grown out of the entitlements theories of Amartya Sen and Bebbington's Capitals and Capabilities, and more recently Ribot and Peluso's work on access. And all of these scholars have been richly developing both the theory and the empirical bases for this kind of these kinds of dynamics of how capitals and access to them mediate the trajectories of livelihoods. And both quantitative and qualitative data are used to assess the assets and capabilities of people. But because this is focused on lived realities and local perspectives, if you're interested in getting into this kind of work, find a friendly anthropologist. But the real trick to it is go talk to people. And it sounds so simple, yet a lot of times we study how livelihood systems operate without talking to the people there. It takes a lot of time, but I think it's actually very cost effective. Hiring local enumerators to conduct surveys doesn't cost very much compared to a postdoc in the States. So it's worth talking to them because they can tell you how the things they have constrain and enable their livelihoods. It's a very nice direct way to understand their lives is to ask them. And this framework is often used to study environmental change, understanding coping capacities, particularly now to climate change. So the fact that it is also used to study the capacity for adaptation, and that being the other half of the equation that we're going to want to get to, is something we'll come back to. And it comes in lots of flavors, so you'll see it out there if you're not familiar with the literature. But this really plays a beautiful role nesting into the perceived gaps in terms of incorporating how humans co-produce ecosystem services. We call it, how they use their capabilities to make a livelihood, but from the ecosystem service side, that's how people are coming in to co-produce it. So we've established now that we can add in some important ingredients into our perspective of moving from natural capitals to human well-being, and that's the co-production, that's dependent on assets, and that you have to take a disaggregated perspective looking at different groups of people separately because their assets are going to be different and lead to unequal benefits and values. And also, different assets are required for different steps of this procedure. The same assets in terms of knowledge and financial capital that you need to change your livelihood to a new activity or to invest in more agricultural equipment and know how it's going to turn out may be different from the labor that you need to then do it. So this framework gives us a way to break down not only this flow in terms of the capitals needed and the assets needed, but also can allow us to look at multiple services simultaneously and identify trade-offs between them. So now we can ask questions like, what else other than natural capital do people need? And who has those assets? And who controls access to those assets? A very important question. And where are the real trade-offs? And what influences decisions? Wait, we haven't talked about decisions yet. What does influence decisions? Where do human decisions come into this framework? We've gotten it down to the level of a household or maybe an individual, but do we understand why or how people make decisions? And there's a wide consensus among the boots on the ground that, you know, people aren't really that predictable by current mainstream economic theories in terms of what they do. So what do we have to help us understand that part of the equation? Well, one place that we think that decisions comes into this is people's values affecting their assessment of their own capacities, and decisions affecting their their process, how they engage to produce livelihoods. And there are lots of framings of how to include values into this whole scheme, and livelihood adaptation is one of them, to think about how people's understanding of their system and the values that they're getting from their current livelihood affect their decisions of what to do next. So this is starting to take us a little bit more towards adaptation while also bringing decisions into it. And the framework that I wanted to introduce to do this is called a livelihood adaptation approach. It doesn't really have its own name, but it's based on a social ecological systems thinking about what gives a social ecological system resilience, and one of the things is the capacity to adapt. So it has linkages between ecosystems and people, much like ecosystem services, but it's really focused on the question of how that system adjusts or transforms. It treats adaptation as an explicit process, not just something that happens when you introduce a new idea. And that happens over a series of steps where adaptive capacity is those preconditions and motivations and assets that someone needs to make the decision to change what they're doing, whether it's an incremental decision or a transformative decision to change what they're going to do with the cash from last year's crop come planting season this year. And then the assets are part of that decision making, much as it was in the Sustainable Livelihoods framework. And the assets also then come into play when you made your decision and now you have to enact it. And how you have assets determines how well you're able to enact it and get benefits from it. So if this column in the middle looks a little bit familiar, it should, because that's really similar to the ecosystem services cascade model. So these fit together, and what's nice is that the analysis that you do to assess this is the same one we just talked about, but focusing on the constraints and capacity for change in particular. And so to give you, and this is what we need to avoid donkeys getting lifted up by carts, is we want systems that are going to help us understand what are the constraints and capacities when we try and do something different. And that we've got adaptation in the equation now. So we're ready to go and look at a quick example of this to show how it actually gets measured or can be measured in some work that I've been involved with. So quick introduction. Pastoralism in Africa is one of these systems, a resource-dependent system that's livestock-based, and lands are used communally usually. And the livelihoods themselves are very well adapted to dry lands. They depend on mobility to access resources that are patchy both in time and space. This is a livelihood for over 100 million Africans, so not a trivial system to think about. The last 100 years have been really different in Africa. Lots of social and political changes that have restricted the access to mobility and grazing, again, changing that capacity, and also changing some of the demographics of the number of people and livestock. And this has led to cascading ecological and social changes. So where I've been working for a long time in central Kenya is a communally owned chunk of land with pretty semi-arid conditions, 450 millimeters of rainfall. And they've gone through successive droughts. Every time there's a drought, there's massive livestock loss. And what we've seen as people search for solutions is we studied two different things. One was people trying to plant maize along the river. I think I talked about that at USSEE last year. It failed. So we're going to move on to the camels. So over the last 30 years, different households have been gradually adopting camels as an alternative to cattle and goats, their normal stock. And now about 10% of households have tried it. So the question is, how do we understand whether what's enabling people to make this transition and whether it's sustainable? So we talked about capital, but here are my little color codes so that when I talk about what types of assets people are using to get access to resources for a livelihood, the fit between the ecological resource and the asset that the capitals that they have, and the feedbacks. I'll be going through a couple of these just to summarize the situation with camel husbandry. There were some Somalis living in the community about 30 years ago, and they brought camels, and some people started adopting them. They do great on the new vegetation now that the grass has pretty much collapsed. They're really have high, long-lasting milk yields, but in terms of human capital, they require new knowledge. You can't use the same medicines that you use on cattle and goats on camels. And they're very, very difficult to herd. They run away, and that's a problem for a lot of people because they run a long way away. They also have low status in the culture. So in terms of the social capital that livestock play in this really interconnected, reciprocity-based society, the camels aren't playing a role. And in terms of financial capital, they're expensive. So I'm going to speed up a little bit to understand all of what was going on. We used 5 methods. I narrowed it down to 4 in this diagram, and I'm just going to narrow it down to 2 as I go by. But Gabriel, the postdoc who's working with us, is an ethnographer. He's an anthropologist. He talked to everyone who had ever had camels for several hours and recorded it all and wrote it all down and studied it. And it was phenomenal how much information, how much knowledge we got from talking to 28 people. He drew cognitive maps of all the ideas that people represented. Any 2 words that they presented with a causal relationship between them, he mapped those down for everyone. And that cognitive map, we then used a livelihoods lens to understand what types of assets were they talking about and what were the outcomes. And we're going to skip over the synthesis, even though it's really cool. So here's a picture of the cognitive map. You don't have to read all the little boxes, but once the cause and effect relationships between concepts were all mapped down, we started to get a picture very clearly from their perspective of what assets were necessary and what assets were constraining both their decisions to adopt camels and then their practice once they had them, and how those outcomes were changing their lives. So for example, this is just a pullout from one area of the environmental reasons that motivated people to adopt them. Environmental change, there's no grass, there's droughts, cattle were dying, there's nowhere to move them to. Lack of milk at home was the proximal reason why people adopted camels. So you get a pretty clear understanding of how assets are interplaying to drive a decision. Once they got them, some of the benefits that they were getting, the outcomes, followed 2 separate trajectories, which we were able to disaggregate because these maps were drawn for every individual. And all families indicated that they were using the milk for their family needs. But a subset were engaged in market specialization, selling animals, selling milk, or using their camels in tourism to carry tourists around. And these people are headed on pretty different economic trajectories as well. So we were able to see all that by just conducting qualitative interviews and then analyzing them in a systematic yet qualitative way. Skipping through all that to move on. It's fascinating. The paper just came out in Regional Environmental Change like a week ago. So it's really, really cool. You'll love it. You can go read it. So we'll move on. Now we have ecosystem services coupled up with a way to analyze the capacities of people to co-produce those services. And also these new ideas about analyzing adaptation at these different junctures when the service is, when a function, someone decides to utilize that as an ecosystem service, like I'm going to start using wood to make charcoal, and then the capacities are needed to enact that. So we've got these 3 ingredients already, and those are really the ingredients we're hoping to bring together to be able to understand both the connections between natural capital and livelihoods and in an adaptation context. So to bring it all together, we thought about it a long time, worked through many diagrams, and we want it all to be dynamic, like adaptation is. It's an ongoing process. So this is the framework that we've come up with. And the next project underway is to use it to guide a series of empirical and modeling research questions. The empirical research, I've described how that can be done, and we have a lot of empirical research that uses GIS or ground truthing, lots of methods to assess ecosystem service provisions. But the trick about modeling these is a new question. So what we'd like to do is be able to understand how the small scale actions of farmers on a landscape scale up to change larger scale ecological processes. And then on the social side, we also need to be able to understand this disaggregated human level of decision making within its cultural and institutional context. And to do that type of modeling brings us to things like agent-based modeling. There are now a lot of agent-based models that represent human decision-making. And what's really exciting is they're getting used a lot in conjunction with land change science, with cellular automata or other representations of heterogeneous landscape change. So agent-based modeling, if you're not familiar with it, simulates each individual, either a person or a household or a tree, as an agent in a system, and each one gets simulated through time. And all the agents have their internal processes, but they also have these rules that determines how they respond to changing conditions. And those rules are probabilistic. So the system doesn't behave the same way each time you run a simulation. Instead, the patterns emerge from these partly randomized interactions between all the components. So you can run experiments testing how different types of rules or decision-making processes or different climate scenarios or other drivers change the behavior of the system. And this is, I looked in my EndNote library, and I had 161 papers in my folder on land use change plus ABM. So there's a lot of work going into this and a lot of pretty exciting stuff. And it really is pushing the science of ABMs forward, which is important because they are popular. People like using these to explore scenarios. And the representation of a co-evolving social ecological system is really hard to represent with any other kind of modeling. And you can use them to test theories of behavior. Maya Schluter's work is my favorite on that subject, and explore things like threshold dynamics. And for us, getting at the cross-scale interactions is really exciting. And what's also cool is that these are used often in participatory applications where stakeholders use the model and explore the scenarios to understand how changing certain parameters in their landscape would change. But the reason it's great that there's growing popularity is because they need a lot of work and they need to be better understood. There are drawbacks and just flat out skeptics. It is true that the methods for verifying an agent-based model are still evolving. I think pattern-oriented modeling is a great step forward, but it's not the same as validating a normal model. And they are not predictive in the normal sense of a model because you're more or less just looking at what types of emergent properties might come about if the system that you were modeling was like the one you created on your computer. And I've heard the direct criticism, they're just too wishy-washy. And this is an issue, but it's one of the few ways that we can represent emergent properties. And while they may be wishy-washy, that's a reality. There are a lot of emergent properties out there. And so as a way to develop hypotheses to confirm with other research approaches, I think is where they have their greatest power. And we're starting to see a lot of cool things come out of that. This is just an example of a very large multi-agent system called Ludus that's been used to do a lot of this type of work. And you can see on the right-hand side that they have landscape and neighborhood dynamics that all impact their agents. And they have both household agents that are running around on the landscape, and also chunks of the landscape themselves are agents. One of the tricks with modeling behaviors in this context, if you want to parameterize your model to represent what people do, is somehow turning your study of what people do into probabilities for a model, because the rules are probability based in these types of simulations. And Eric Kemp-Benedict has done some very cool work on this, along with some other folks. So he was the one who introduced me to it last year, and I'm really excited to get working on this. Is using Bayesian belief networks, where you conduct interviews, but in a very specific way, so that people are actually helping determine what strategies they chose under what conditions. And then if you have lots of interviews, you can then see what the probabilities are of people making certain choices given certain assets that they have or certain environmental conditions. And from that, you actually develop your probabilities for use as rules in the agent-based model. And if you also know what the economic outcomes were of those strategies when people applied them, you can start using the model to ask questions like, what was the most helpful water structures for poor people? What types of structures changed their lives the most, and who was able to get them? So that's the kind of modeling approach that can be applied to a framework that brings all these things together. Although the different pieces of it can be studied independently without an integrating model. And one of the other advantages of having an integrating model is this idea of getting back to the participatory on the ground. And this photo is just an example from a paper that used companion modeling, a role-playing game that then they used to parameterize an agent-based model, so that people were acting out the game and then the computer ran the simulation of the scenarios they were creating. And people were really empowered and decided that farmers and the forestry guards should actually cooperate, and formed a new partnership out of it. So some useful things on the ground can come out of these highly abstracted models. So in synthesis, getting adaptation into the study of resource-dependent social ecological systems means bridging natural capital and livelihood outcomes approaches. And to do that, I would argue that we need to think about the people, think about their assets, and think about the process of adaptation itself. So we have come a long way from where we started with really simple valuations that are just a production function of amount of some natural stock. And I think we've come a long way from sort of axiomatic or aggregate assumptions about people themselves. And we're trying really hard not to treat adaptation like a light switch, that it actually is a process that has all the same complexities as the co-creation of ecosystem services themselves. So this can be a little disorienting because this isn't how a lot of people actually do this stuff. It seems sensible, but these approaches, I mean, those like 8 papers I showed you, that's okay, there's maybe 2 times as many as that, but this isn't very widely adopted. And why not? Well, sticking with the Dorothy example, to do this kind of work requires a lot of teamwork, and it requires working across boundaries of people who think really differently. And that's a challenge for everyone, and was one of the sort of mind blowers when I got here to UGA. Finding the people to work with to do that is in itself a challenge. However, we're all meeting through Ecological Economics Society, so I think we're in the right space to bridge those things in a trusting, safe, and hopefully welcoming environment. Fieldwork. It does require going and talking to people. And it's time-consuming and it's difficult and requires a whole different skill set. Which is again why it's good to find partners who have different skills than you if you're not an anthropologist or a hands-on empirical geographer of people or something like that, because how you do that fieldwork really matters. And then there's always resistance. I showed you the graph at the beginning. There's an uphill battle to get a lot of these methods that talking to people counts as a way of knowing something about people, still meets with a great deal of resistance. It's not quantitative and can't possibly inform policy. Okay, we're working on that, but that resistance can hopefully be less of a barrier as more and more people get familiar with the benefits and the nuanced understandings that come. And I think you also have to be willing to challenge your own beliefs and be ready to find things that you weren't expecting or didn't want to know. For instance, that, you know, conserving biodiversity in some places makes people's lives worse. Sorry, it does, you know, and that's not something as a conservation biologist I ever want to say. But if you go and talk to people, you find out that's true. So making space for that and, you know, carrying on the negotiations about what it means to work towards sustainability, it does mean challenging your own beliefs, and that can be a tall order. So as I go about trying to think about these things, these are a few things that I bear in mind. One is that the human system is made up of n different individuals, not an aggregate statistic divided by n. It's really hard to think that way all the time. There's just too much tradition of thinking as a population ecologist for me. But my first step should probably be to go to listen to people a lot, including my colleagues. And when I'm thinking about household level assets, you know, keep thinking about who has these and why do they have them. It's a paradigm shift for me to think in terms of going 2 steps back from the ecosystem service itself, but it's where the action is and where the problems arise. And also recognizing that my own values are shaping the assessment itself. So I need to pay attention to what I'm not including in my assessment and why. That reflexivity, I think, is just helpful to stay grounded. And lastly, I should probably avoid Wizard of Oz references when I'm trying to convince anyone that something is a good idea. So thanks for your patience, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Liz, this might seem to be a silly question, but I'm trying to get my arms around all that you said. And at one end, we have the theoretical modeling, and then at the other end, we have African tribes that we're interviewing. What % of the middle ground would you say is covered by the analysis you've done so far?
Well, given that the theoretical modeling is the part that hasn't been done, we're sort of moving in a we're not sort of starting at the ends and coming in. But I do think that we have a good bit of information on the ecological transitions that are going on. Ryan Unks, who is a PhD student with me, and Laura German have explored deeply the institutional context from a political ecology perspective. We understand the ecohydrology of degradation, and Ryan also completed a really, really cool landscape ecology analysis over time of how the landscape was changing and where livestock pressure was over a 30-year period. So we can associate specific vegetation shifts with livestock pressures. So I think there's a lot there to work with, but that came about because the team was really, really interdisciplinary and, you know, sort of spread out in terms of their interests out there from the get-go. I mean, I spent 12 years there just planting grass, and nothing got exciting until those folks came along. So I think for that project, we're in good shape to you know, try and do some modeling. We need some more data on how much camels eat, and I don't know whether we're going to get that. But I think we have a lot of the components. And some of the studies that are doing this work have long-term teams, but are covering all this ground. And I would like to mention that I'll post a bibliography from this talk on my website, which is at kinglab.uga.edu. I didn't have time to stick it in the presentation. It'd probably be easier just to put it on my website anyway. It'll be /USSEE, a C. So if you're interested in any of these papers, they'll be up there by tonight.
Oh, great.
Did that answer your question?
I think it does, yes. And I have one more if you don't mind. Are you at the top of the management pyramid?
Pyramid? You overestimate our organization.
Does everybody report to you?
That project we wrapped up last year. Ryan is now doing a postdoc with one of the people whose agent-based modeling papers I really love, and Mark Goldman, who's a political geographer back in Kenya. Laura and I are working on more stuff, but it wasn't very hierarchical to start with, although I was PI on the form. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Is there a question here in the chat that you may have partially answered in reference?
Erin, you going in and out?
Oh, yeah. Any good complete ABM pubs one could use as a model for building? Yes, there are several great ABM pubs one could use as a model, and that's exactly what I intend to do. And I have a nice annotated bibliography with my notes on them that I'd be happy to share. So David Toledo, or no, that was from Bob Newman. Yeah, if you check my website later tonight at kinglab.uga.edu/USSEE, there'll be that stuff on there. Cool.
We're also going to send out a follow-up email to participants, and we'll send everyone can send that link directly as well, and the link to the video once it's posted.
Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So Justin's going to run to my office and grab my power cord. Let's do that here. It's not in the green key. So hopefully we have a few minutes. Wow, that was quick. Any other questions? You can ask me after my battery dies. But if there aren't any more, then sure. Oh, okay. Oops, scroll up. Oh, any good? Mention upcoming paper. Does it explain the methodology? Yes, it sure does. And the reference is Volpato and King, 2018. I will be happy to post that as well. It's in the pre whatever, but it's regional environmental change. It doesn't have a number yet, but it's published. So also, if you send me an email, I'll be happy to send you the PDF. So we are the 1%ers. Yes, we are. Yes. Okay. Well, I don't see too many other questions. Margaret Conroy. Oh, the Margaret Conroy?
Do you remember me? I was.
Yes, I sure do. Of course. Hi, Margaret.
So I was wondering, when you're working on the economic part in Africa, since so much of the use is for home use, do you use monetary measures, or do you also use, some sort of other measure, for like the milk they're getting out of it and the utility of that?
I wonder if that means her battery died. I think she just dropped off.
Okay, folks. Well, thanks for joining us.
Do you want to give her a minute to see if she can come back and answer that, or do you want to?
Sure.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for her to come back, I'll just do a quick plug here. So I will send out everybody registered an email with a link to the recording of the webinar with bibliography that Lizzie mentioned, with a little bit of information about our next webinar, which is going to be on Wednesday, February 7th. Same time, it will be held by Lazarus from UC Berkeley, who's worked to develop a new metric that combines elements of sustainability, efficiency, and welfare. Either for the global footprint network modeling for their ecological footprint, which many of you might be familiar with.
I had some trouble with that audio, Aaron. I'm not sure anybody else did.
Okay. My internet's being choppy. I'll send it in the message box.
Okay, good. Well, Liz is a heavy-duty person. She packs a lot of stuff in, and she's creative.
All right. Well, I think we've lost her, and we're right about at our end time here. Can you hear me now, John?
I can, yes, clearly.
Okay. Yep. Well, thank you for joining us today. Hopefully, we're taking follow up. And just look out for an email for us with some more information and the link to the survey.